On March the 9th, 1945, 279 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers took off from America's bases in the Marianas Islands for an attack on the Japanese capital, Tokyo. The Superfortresses were the biggest effective bombers of the Second World War. They carried a load of nearly 8 tons at speeds approaching 350 miles per hour at altitudes up to 35,000 feet over a range of 4,000 miles. The new commander of the American bombers in the Marianas, Curtis LeMay, had decided on a new method of operation. In order to foil the Japanese defenses, attacks were to be switched from high-level day operations to low-level strikes by night. The other important change introduced by LeMay was that the planes would carry loads of the newly developed incendiaries. Each B-29 could carry 40 clusters of 38 incendiary bombs in its load. The raid of the 9th of March was the first test of these new methods. The results of this raid showed the approach to be horrifyingly effective. A quarter of the area of Tokyo, over 16 square miles, was burnt out. Over 267,000 buildings were destroyed, and civilian casualties topped 130,000. The Americans lost only 14 aircraft. In the next 9 days, the cities of Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya were similarly devastated. By the 19th of March, the raids had to cease. The Americans had dropped over 10,000 tons of incendiaries and had run out of supplies. Of course, as soon as more incendiaries were delivered, the raids resumed, and a series of firestorms were unleashed that killed over 250,000 Japanese civilians in a 3-month period. Japanese morale had begun to plummet after the initial raid on Tokyo. The authorities were unable to provide any support, emergency services were non-existent, and there were inadequate plans to deal with catastrophe on this scale. The Japanese civilians were rudely awakened to the inability of the state to protect them from attack or to minister to their needs in the wake of attack. LeMay began dropping leaflets on potential targets to warn the population, and over 8.5 million people fled from the cities. This panic-induced withdrawal of labor added to the bomb damage, which had destroyed over 600 major war factories. War production dropped dramatically. Oil refining dropped 83%. Aircraft engine output dropped 75%. Electronics equipment dropped 70%, and the production of airframes by 60%. The damage and the demoralization of the civilian population meant that Japan ceased to be able to maintain its means of waging war. America had wrested the key to success in modern war, air superiority, from the overextended Japanese forces. American fighter aircraft, carrier-borne swarms of attackers and bombers, and the fleets of superfortresses dominated Japan's airspace. It can be argued that Japan's huge losses at sea, critically the destruction of her merchant marine by America's submarines, had already made defeat inevitable. However, the Japanese population did not know this. The bombing campaign spelled out the hopelessness of the situation to all except a few military fanatics. The atomic bombs may have been the deciding factor in the official surrender, but most of the Japanese were unaware of the nuclear devastation until after the war. They understood the defeat, and their proof came in the form of the firestorms, the incendiary raids, in the unpredictable carrier power and the terror they brought to Japan. Between the First and Second World Wars, a mighty theory of air power had been developed under the general description strategic bombing. Here, in the dying months of the war, the theory finally demonstrated some of the power that had been expected of it. It may not have been the major cause of the Japanese defeat, but this is a quibble, as it was certainly the major cause of their surrender. With the Japanese, defeat and surrender had already proved repeatedly to be two very separate concepts. On the other side of the world, the Allies fought another major strategic campaign, or to be more precise, two parallel campaigns against Germany. Here, against a different enemy, first the British and then the Americans had tested their pre-war conceptions of strategic bombing. The American model was clear-sighted and easily encapsulated. They felt sure that a force of bombers, well-armed and heavily armoured, flying high and close together, could make precision daylight raids over enemy territory. The British had started with a similar view, but had rapidly retreated from it. They were ill-equipped even to try it at the outbreak of the war. The Americans were better equipped when they tried it. Both failed abjectly. The British official history of the strategic air offensive against Germany sums up the doctrine of strategic bombing in the following words. The strategic air offensive is a means of direct attack on the enemy state with the object of depriving it of the means or the will to continue the war. This is a very succinct statement of the pre-war expectation, both British and American. However, the official history, written after the war, goes on to qualify it. It may in itself be the instrument of victory, or it may be the means by which victory can be won by other forces. In a very dry way, this sums up the learning process of the war. In the war against Germany, the strategic bombing theory did not work. Under the theory, armadas of bombers were to be deployed. They would precisely land their bombs on their targets. The targets would be obliterated. The maps would be adjusted to remove the target, and the next raid would be planned. In practice, armadas of bombers dropped their bombs, on average, about 5 miles away from their targets. They suffered heavy losses and did little damage. The enemy fighters chewed them up, and there were no escorts to aid them. When the British air chiefs asked for a quadrupling of their forces to allow them to knock Germany out of the war, Churchill tartly suggested that they quadruple their accuracy and try for the same effect. The early reverses suffered in the strategic campaign caused a revision of the methods. The British changed to bombing by night. They also heeded the message of initial post-bombing assessments. If the bombers were not getting near to the targets, then abandon small targets. Target entire cities. Each bomb dropped would then hit something in the city. Precision went out of the window. The pre-war definition lost half of its meaning. The destruction of an enemy's means of production was seconded to the destruction of his civilian population's morale. The Germans called it terror bombing. Ignoring the hypocrisy of such words from that source, it's still a good description. Inevitably, the British raids prompted the Germans to develop an efficient night fighter force. Eventually, the RAF would be forced back into daylight because it had become safer. In the interim, the RAF flew its missions and lost its crews. Losses were cripplingly high and constant. Effects on the targets ranged from occasionally catastrophic to mostly minimal. Target location, pathfinding, target marking, a variety of radars and radio direction aids, bigger, nastier bombs, better bomb sights, attempts to turn bow fighters into night escorts, all were tried and adopted. The accuracy increased until it could be guaranteed that an average bomb would have fallen within 300 yards of the target. Yet the British had become addicted to relatively random bombing and persisted with it well beyond the end of its justification. The American Air Force had not initially placed quite so much store in the strategic theories, being simply content to prove the value and power of aircraft. They were still part of the United States Army and did not have a tenuous independence to protect, a factor which had contributed to the RAF's distorted attempts to justify its existence. The need to do so emphasizes the widespread difficulty in absorbing the new reality of aerial command of the battlefield. There were many airmen who had clear ideas of the likelihoods of technologically advanced warfare and who had sounded ample warnings of the impending battles. Their understanding of the importance of air power had taken a long time to sink into wider acceptance. However, unfortunately for the purity of theory, the air enthusiasts had failed to define the necessary precondition for a successful campaign, which is control of the air. The idea that bombers could overcome aircraft designed for the purpose of shooting them down has never been greatly inspired. When the bombers ran out of air superiority, that is, when they went outside the range of their escorts, they were in routine danger of being destroyed. The Air Forces belligerently trumpeted successes while casting around for remedies. Those civilians who knew the truth of the situation started to doubt the conviction of the air chiefs of both allies, but the attacks had to continue. They were considered good for civilian morale, as symbolic, immediate and continual retribution. They pleased Stalin. They tied up fighters and artillery in the defense of the Reich, rather than setting them loose on the front lines. But the pre-war expectations were still sadly wide of the mark. Not until long-range fighters could escort the bombers for the entire journey did the situation improve. From then on, the tide swung heavily against the Germans. Their Luftwaffe had no option but to attack the incoming bombers, and they were overwhelmed by the numbers and quality of the new Allied fighters. Hitler's proud Air Force entered its death throes. German preparation for war in the air had followed a different course from that of the two English-speaking great powers. The focus of their attention was on the battlefield. Even before Hitler's rise to power, the Germans concluded that strategic bombing would not work. Their concentration was on the most efficient meshing of armored forces and overwhelming air power to create an irresistible attack. When Hitler came to power, the concept of the Blitzkrieg was already established. The role of Hitler in the development of the Luftwaffe is hard to measure. His popular image as the man of destiny was purely theatrical. During the 30s, he was certainly no dynamic decision-maker. He preferred to remain aloof as an arbiter of last resort, rather than involve himself in choices or giving orders. He was an intensely lazy man, whose skills were political. Intellectually incoherent and disinterested in detail, he let his subordinates squabble and bargain and get on with the work. Thus, the General Staff and Goering's Air Staff created the Air Force with only a little meddling from above. Hitler was pleased with the Luftwaffe as a reflection of his power and prestige, but the structure of the Air Force that had evolved proved in practice to be incapable of meeting all of his demands. Hitler made his assessments on economic and political grounds and constantly expected that military priorities would follow. His ability to not listen to anything that he did not want to hear was to become more refined as the war went on. But it was already fully developed by 1935, when German rearmament went into top gear. The treaties were not renounced, they were ignored. This youth rally was filmed in 1935, and the accompanying displays of military might do a convincing mockery of primitive blitzkrieg. The German attack upon Poland was accompanied by 2,000 aircraft. Most of these were modern frontline planes, developed to fill a range of specialist roles as part of an integrated campaign. The Poles had few modern aircraft in a total fleet of 600. The Luftwaffe achieved almost immediate total air superiority. Many sorties were flown in direct support of the attacking columns, but the fleet operated in small groups. This dispersion brought widespread disruption and confusion. The Polish railway system was wrecked, Polish forces isolated, cities demoralized. The bombing and harassment from the air covered the whole country, while below, the armored punch of the German panzers pushed ahead and completed a series of encirclements of the ill-prepared Poles. The overrunning of Poland took from September the 1st to September the 28th. Hitler's critics were dumbfounded, and Hitler was very pleased. He toured the Western Front and inspected work on the Siegfried Line. The strikes of the German war organization placed the majority of Western Europe under their control in a very short period of active campaigning. Though the French certainly were well equipped to fight the panzers in their own kind, French organization and concepts were very old-fashioned and ineffective. After a prolonged attack by the Luftwaffe on a 1.5-mile sector of the front, the Germans threw in the force of 7 panzer divisions. The response of the French was disorganized and far too slow. The Stuka dive bombers acted as heavy artillery, accompanying the armored divisions. This was what they'd been designed for, and in coordinated action, they proved unstoppable. Britain and France had very inadequate air power drawn up to meet the German attack. The British had retained most of their more modern types at home, and there was a preponderance of obsolete planes in the French Air Force. Together, they deployed around 1,500 aircraft against the Germans' 3,000. Again, the Germans achieved air superiority quickly. On the ground, things should have been far harder for the Germans. They were severely overextended and vulnerable to any armoured attack against their flanks. However, it proved beyond the Allies' abilities to organise such a thrust, though the weapons were available. The French command were immobilised in shock at the speed of developments, and the opportunity to decisively meet the thin shell of armour that hid Germany's weakness was missed. The converging German forces sweeping through the Netherlands and the Ardennes broke the Allied line and trapped much of the strongest French units and most of the British. German air operations were in the main against purely military targets and contributed magnificently to the success of the campaign. One week after the commencement of the attack, the panzers reached the Channel and isolated the Allied forces in northern France and Belgium. The noose was then pulled tighter, and the Allies consolidated as they fell back towards the Channel port of Dunkirk. Goering should have been content to bask in the glory of his force's success, but he could not resist his weaknesses, and vainglorious boasting was certainly one of these. He loudly claimed that the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped Allies on the coast. Hitler, terrified of losing the power of his few panzer divisions halted them short of a frontal assault on the disordered defenders. He was backed by his high command in this, although the field commander's rage at being stopped was loud and continuous through the days that followed. With German anti-aircraft artillery ringing the port and the might of the Luftwaffe above, Dunkirk's mass of evacuating troops should have been an easy target. However, the British doggedly disrupted their enemy's claim to air supremacy with flights from England. The Luftwaffe was not organized for the job in hand, and though the bombing and strafing of Dunkirk was almost continuous, the evacuation was successful, beyond the bounds of any expectation. Goering's planes failed to even seal off the seaside of the pocket, let alone reduce the defences. Nearly 340,000 men were evacuated from Dunkirk. The prestige of the Luftwaffe, unquestioned to that time, suffered its first major damage. The next major task that fell to the Luftwaffe was the reduction of Britain as a preparation for the expected invasion. The German army and navy, both very dubious about the feasibility of the scheme, were content to have the Air Force saddled with the tasks of wiping out the RAF and subduing the British ability to respond as prerequisites for cross-channel landings. The Battle of Britain began. Germany's fighters were very short-ranged, designed for continental operations in coordination with the army. Germany had no fleet of large bombers. The tactical emphasis of the Luftwaffe's design meant that they deployed mostly twin-engined light bombers. Excellent as these planes were for their designed tasks, they lacked the ability to sustain an independent assault. Against the most modern opposition they had faced to date, at the limits of their range, in the face of well-trained and very courageous pilots, aided by excellent ground organization, radar, and the breaking of the Germans' own codes, the Luftwaffe fought a battle that they very nearly won. At the point of almost succeeding in overrunning the RAF, the Germans lost their confidence and switched to night operations. The outcome left the invasion of Britain abandoned, British determination reinforced, and the Luftwaffe severely damaged. In the course of the Battle of Britain, from July to October 1940, the Germans lost 1,733 aircraft, while the RAF lost 915 fighters. The German losses were very important to the Luftwaffe. The core of their strength had been not only the planes, but the battle-hardened pilots and crew. Many of these men drowned in the Channel, died in the crash of their aircraft, or were taken prisoner. The RAF pilot losses were a much smaller percentage, as anyone who survived the loss of their plane tended to end up back in English hands. The only significant success the Luftwaffe had in the period was in curtailing the British merchant flow in the Channel. The German morale took a battering. Their planes were being matched and their losses were crippling. They recorded a wildly exaggerated 3,058 British losses during the battle. Yet the RAF still was coming up to meet them in numbers. They felt they should have already won the battle, yet it dragged on. As it did, Hitler's trust in the Luftwaffe drained away. He was already disenchanted with the boisterous windbaggery of Goering, and with his loss of faith in the Luftwaffe went his interest in it. The squadrons would get little rest after the Battle of Britain. They were withdrawn and refitted for a new campaign. Goering would continue to slide from favour, and the Luftwaffe would continue to run down its resources. Hitler had abandoned the idea of invading Britain and had turned back to the east. The Luftwaffe would begin to leave more bones in the Balkans, in Greece, and in Russia. Across the Atlantic, the United States, already committed to the side of Britain and increasingly hostile towards the Axis powers, was undergoing an industrial upheaval as it was slowly drawn into the war. In 1939, Germany outproduced the USA in aircraft by 8,295 to 5,856. The following year, the USA outproduced the Germans by 12,804 more to 10,826, having more than doubled production. In 1944, the United States produced 96,318 aircraft. The same sort of graphs show for American production improvements across a wide range of arms. In 1940, the USA made 331 tanks and self-propelled guns. In the next 4 years, they made just over 100,000. America's huge resources were tied to highly efficient management. During the war, the average output per worker in the US was over double the output of the equivalent German worker. This allows for Germany being a war zone, as it compares the maximum peacetime production that could have come from the factories. Japan's production efficiency was appalling, about 1/6 the American. Though today they are the masters of managerial efficiency, the Japanese were then the least well organized of the major powers. During the war, the 5 major participants all increased their production of arms and war essentials. Japan quadrupled her construction of merchant ships between 1941 and 1944 to over 1 million tons. In 1944, the Americans produced over 12 million tons, which was over 10 times their 1941 figure. During the war, the USSR quadrupled its considerable output of aircraft and upped its production of tanks by a factor of 13. The war of the economies was a very one-sided affair. The Allies' production, manpower, wealth and resources dwarfed the Axis potential. The mobilization of the 3 major economies, the UK, USA and USSR, made German and Japanese continuation of the war lunacy. Both regimes seem to have become obsessed with a dramatically pessimistic devotion to struggle for its own sake. Their opponents, increasingly reassured by their strength after the shocks of the early course of the war, now set to grind the Axis to defeat with overwhelming force. Japan had been at war longer than the other participants. The 30s had seen almost continual struggle in China, and some of the earliest examples of the reality of unrestricted bombing, as here in Shanghai. The Japanese had no air force, but placed air fleets under the control of both the Army and the Navy. Their planes were in some ways rudimentary, but they were very effective. Until the Americans brought their power to bear, the Japanese were accustomed to air superiority. The Japanese had performed remarkable feats in the development of their air power. The ability of a plane like the Imperial Navy's famous Zero fighter came as a shock to the Americans when they first encountered it. The Japanese had developed a strong air fleet, which was easily the most capable air force in Asia. Their mastery of the air had made plain to them the value of aircraft in a very practical way. Their rapid expansion at the beginning of the conflict in Asia and the Pacific was built around the cornerstone of their ability to control the air. Keenly aware of the resources of the United States, they sought to improve their bargaining position and keep the US from being able to bring its power to bear. This, of course, seriously underestimated the potential of the Americans. However, Japanese training was slipshod, their factories disorganized, and their design workshops unable to come up with aircraft that could wrest back an advantage over the Americans. Better planes, better pilots, in larger numbers, would oppose the shrinking remnants of Japanese air power, and they would destroy it. Not until the US carrier planes would present them with large numbers of opponents they could not overcome, would the Japanese be able to assess the true worth of their air fleets. Japan's repeated landings of troops in the rapid expansion of the empire depended on localized force sufficient to win air supremacy. The American carriers reversed this. They provided their own air supremacy wherever they went. They did enormous and continual damage to the Japanese garrisons and their local air forces. The Japanese started the war richer in pilots than they were ever to be again. It was a continuous decline. The Navy's precious carrier crews were deployed ashore to bolster the local squadrons, but in the process, they too would be wiped out. Japanese wartime training was so limited to begin with, and then so restricted because of lack of fuel, that they could not replace the loss of experienced airmen. Those men were sacrificed at a very rapid rate, and Japan exhausted her ability to fly planes effectively before she exhausted her ability to produce planes. While the Japanese war plans were being rigidly defined before Pearl Harbor, Japan's aircraft swept all before them. They met other types only in small numbers, and usually those types were obsolete. In China in the 30s, they encountered little to give them pause. Japanese aircraft manufacture was slow in picking up speed during the war years. In 1939, they made 4,467 aircraft, and by 1942, this had only climbed to 8,861. In the next 2 years, they made a further 44,573 planes, as the industry was more effectively mobilized. However, this was too little too late. Their total production between 1939 and 1944 was less than 2/3 of US production in 1944 alone. Very few improvements were made in Japanese designs during the conflict, and the deficiencies in the pre-war designs were such that they were outclassed by America's new generation of combat aircraft. Japan's rulers gambled the country's future on the basis of a qualitative superiority that proved to be a misreading of reality. Despite the brilliance of the Army's offensive campaigns, their successes were ephemeral. The air supremacy they seized in their expansion was ground down rapidly, and they had no reserves to turn to. Like the Germans, the Japanese army used their planes in coordination with ground forces as a tactical servant of the battlefield. Independent air operations were limited. This was the reverse of the situation with the Allied Air Force chiefs in Europe. The air commanders, particularly the British, were very uncooperative towards attempts to ally their main activity to the forces on land. Cooperative effort grew separately, and the strategic bombing forces acted to their own agenda for nearly all of the war. However, the paralysis that was to be inflicted upon Germany grew out of the strategic campaign. Fighter escorts, returning to Britain, began to make low-level sweeps across the countryside, bringing their guns to bear on targets of opportunity wherever they presented themselves. Soon, equipped with rockets and more specialist arms, they were making sorties for such missions alone. One of the Allied Air Force's greatest achievements was the preparatory work for the Normandy invasion and the cover and assistance given to the ground forces once they were ashore. Playing an auxiliary role in the wider strategy for once, even the heavy bomber forces were diverted to these tasks. The two major aims of the pre-invasion campaign were to suppress the Luftwaffe and destroy the Germans' lines of communication to the invasion zone. With fleets of medium and light bombers and swarming fighter bombers, the air onslaught was directed against German defenses and the transport networks of France. With the bridges over the Seine and Loire rivers smashed, Normandy became an isolation zone. German reinforcements had to make wide detours, constantly under harassment from the air. They arrived at the Normandy battlefront tired and disorganized. The paralysis of the Germans' ability to deploy applied doubly to their efforts to bring supplies forward to the defenders. The Germans defended stoutly with their available forces, and the Allies were to remain sealed into a fairly small bridgehead in Normandy for nearly 2 months. This apparent stalemate was actually of immense benefit to the Allies. The strangulation of communications was such that the Germans were never able to concentrate force. Units were sent into the battle as they arrived. The 3 panzer divisions that could have been grouped to assault the beaches were committed in pieces to plug the defences. They were whittled down by constant harassment from above and a succession of small but furious brushes with the invaders. Being mechanised, the panzers were among the first reserves to arrive at the scene, and they were ground down first. The countryside behind the beaches was unsuitable for tank warfare, but it was here that they were committed. By the time the Allies broke out into the wide expanses of northern France, there was little armoured strength left to oppose them. The near total collapse of the transport networks under the barrage of the bombers and fighter bombers was very important in the Allies' success. The other major aim of the offensive, the suppression of the Luftwaffe, was similarly successful and similarly important as a contribution to the advance. However, the strategic commands of the air forces wanted their bombers back to resume the pounding of Germany, so the job of supporting the invasion was left to the tactical forces. The Blitzkrieg was now reversed. The close support of air power to armoured columns merged into a deep isolation zone behind the German lines. Here, there was no safety from the constant attentions of the fighter bombers. On the day after D-Day, the German High Command ordered 2 divisions to move from the Pas-de-Calais and Belgium to Normandy. This was a distance of not much more than a couple of 100 miles, yet the earliest that units of these divisions could arrive was 17 days later. It took over a month for some elements of the division coming from Belgium to reach Normandy. The campaign against the Luftwaffe had grown with the massing of American aircraft. Huge numbers of Thunderbolts, Lightnings and Mustangs had joined the British fighters. Long-range escorts were available for all daytime bombing missions. Losses in the daytime fell dramatically. The British night bombing losses became heavier than the American statistic. In the dark, the Luftwaffe's night fighters could still operate with relative safety from fighter interference. By day, the German aircraft were outnumbered and outfought and were swept from the sky. The Luftwaffe had no options. They had to rise to meet the incoming bombers, even though they knew they stood little chance of success. As the number of Allied fighters soared, they soon outstripped the need for escorts. This surplus power was soon organized for full-time fighter and fighter-bomber activity. There was now no respite for the German Air Force. It was sought out at its bases and destroyed on the ground, if it was not caught in the air and destroyed there. This color combat camera footage is selected from film taken in 3 aircraft over a 2-week period just after D-Day. The 3 Thunderbolts were involved in full-time fighter bombing duties, and the footage makes clear the way Allied air power had come to dominate the German ability to continue the fight. Hitler, who had become increasingly intrusive in the decisions of the High Command and had effectively seized direct control of much of the running of the fronts, demanded, as was his habit, that there should be no retreat in the face of the invaders. He persisted with this even after the Allies had built up sufficient strength to be safe from German dislodgement. The effect was disastrous for the German army. Units were exposed to the Allied tactical aircraft for long periods as they moved up to the front, and then they were thrown away in the fighting. German accomplishments in the field were magnificent, but futile. German industrial production continued to rise through most of the war. The reorganization of the German economy onto a wartime footing was belated due to the weakness of the Nazi leaders and their internal squabbling. The efforts of Germany's factories over the last 2 years of the war reflect not only the effectiveness of the industrial mobilization, but also the relative failure of the strategic bombing campaign. Over the course of the war, the British had retreated further and further from attacking specific targets, and a majority of their attacks had become area bombing. Despite remarkable improvements in the accuracy of raids and the availability of fighter cover, the RAF staff persisted in the view that their powerful fleet simply showered Germany with bombs, largely at random. The US bombers stuck more closely to their original intentions and restricted their raids as much as possible to specific targets of military significance. Despite the Germans' increasing production, the effectiveness of their reordering of industry was undermined by the campaign against their means of communication. Between August and December 1944, German rail deliveries faded from 900,000 freight cars to 550,000. By March 1945, this figure had collapsed to just over 200,000. Supplies lay undeliverable in factory stockpiles, were destroyed in transit, or were abandoned, immobilized in the chaos of the railway networks. The decline of the Luftwaffe had accelerated. Shortages, particularly in fuel, restricted activity and curtailed training. Some of the Luftwaffe planes destroyed on the ground had already been immobilized for want of gasoline. By May 1944, though replacement aircraft were still flowing from the factories in considerable numbers, German pilot losses exceeded the available replacements. Those replacements were barely trained, and very few lived long enough to become effective. Up until the preparation for D-Day, the Luftwaffe had still been capable of contesting supremacy with the bomber fleets and their escorts. After the invasion, when the strategic bombing of Germany reached a crescendo, the Luftwaffe was able to do little to respond. American air power, based in England, was organized in two air forces, the 8th and 9th. The 8th conducted the strategic campaign, while the 9th had been formed as a tactical air force to support the ground forces and disrupt the German ability to respond. This tactical air army employed 18 groups of fighters, around 1,500 aircraft, as well as 11 groups equipped with light bombers and attack aircraft. Together with their British counterparts, they were the basis of the success of the invasion. It could not have been launched without them. The success of the tactical campaign in support of the invasion has tended to cloud its failings. Though the disruption of communications hampered German response, the period immediately after the landings saw little damage to the German defenders on the battlefield from the air. In part, this was due to a failure in forward air command. Though experience in the desert and in Italy had underlined the importance of this coordination, it was badly organized and ineffective in Normandy. Further, despite the harassment of German units from the air, very little was achieved. No German unit was reduced by air power. They were harassed, slowed, and given no rest, but suffered little physical disruption. Better organization later in the invasion campaign remedied much of the Air Force's deficiencies, and the importance of the Allied aircraft should not be undervalued. But there were grave problems in the high commands. Blinkered obstinacy reached almost religious levels with the majority of the air chiefs. Despite the evidence of reality, there was resistance to cooperation with the armies, some of it going close to sabotage of the wider war goals. Senior Allied airmen remained obsessed with the view that it was not the primary function of the air forces to serve as flying artillery for the army. This was despite the evidence of the role of the Luftwaffe in Germany's remarkable achievements early in the war. The army staffs were equally certain of what their preferences were and strove to ensure themselves of the maximum air support. With the notable exceptions of the UK's Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst and the American General Elwood Quesada, the air chiefs were almost continually uncooperative. The most successful operations of the Strategic Bomber Commands were the series of raids undertaken by the Americans against Germany's oil production and transportation. This campaign commenced immediately after the invasion. Fuel became the Americans' major preoccupation. Germany's oil production was conveniently grouped in three areas: Ploesti, Silesia and the Ruhr. Early missions against oil targets were flown in the face of skepticism from some of the Allied air commands. However, General Spaatz was convinced of the potential of the campaign and pursued it with some cooperation from the RAF. German oil production actually peaked in May 1944. Synthetic oil production, which reached 316,000 tons a month at that time, had fallen to only 17,000 tons 4 months later. Aviation fuel output had fallen from 175,000 tons to just 5,000. By September 1944, Germany was manufacturing aircraft faster than she had at any point previously, yet had no fuel to fly them. Though the Luftwaffe continued to attack wherever and wherever it could, the Allied air strength continued unperturbably to destroy Germany's means of continuing the war. This is, of course, the stated aim of strategic bombing. Given the obviously critical importance of fuel production, it's strange that the campaign directed specifically at the German oil industry came so late in the war. It's a telling comment on the conduct of the strategic bombing that one of its greatest effects was to tie up so much German artillery at home. Destruction of German cities did not destroy civilian morale. German industry continued to increase production, and Germany's ability to maintain the struggle was not seriously diminished. At war's end, these shortcomings tended to be glossed over in maintaining an emphasis on bomber power. That emphasis was a determinant of the post-war composition of air forces. In Vietnam, the USAF found itself well equipped for the wrong sort of job. While it had thousands of B-52s, only 800 F-105 tactical bombers had been built. The genesis of this situation lies in part in a rewriting of inconvenient history by those who held influence in making it. Germany's scientists and engineers had continued their development of several projects that had far-reaching potential to affect the course of the war. However, progress was slow and often hampered by lack of patronage from the Nazis. German jet engines were first flown in 1940, but it was to be over 2 years later before sufficient priority and resources were directed to the program. Only once the first Me-262s were able to reveal their potency was emphasis shifted to the construction of jet aircraft. By then, it was too late to change the situation. Even so, the program was impeded by Hitler's lunatic insistence that Me-262s be able to operate as bombers. Germany's need was for fast interceptors, but the Luftwaffe had to argue with the Nazis to have the jets made available for that role. Only in the last 6 months of the war did small numbers of Me-262s make their presence felt, and the effect was negligible. The German V-weapons were another very significant advance. The program had much greater support than the jet engine for much of the war, and the weapons were deployed in large numbers. Over 30,000 V-1 flying bombs were built. These were pulse jet-powered drone aircraft carrying a 1-ton warhead. Their range was 150 miles, and they had a maximum speed of 400 miles per hour. Their use in large numbers caused some problems for the Allies. But as the V-1 campaign went on, its effectiveness dropped. The Allies became very adept at shooting them down, with anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Thousands were directed against the Dutch city of Antwerp, the Allies' major port late in the war. By the end of that campaign, anti-aircraft artillery alone was accounting for 8 out of every 10 V-1s launched against the city. The accuracy of the V1 was very limited. The bombs were preset to a compass bearing. After launch, they were stabilized and steered by a gyroscopic control. An airlog, driven by a small air screw on the V1's nose, measured a preset distance and then dived the bomb onto its target. In reality, a design fault in the fuel system cut supply to the engine when the nose was dropped, and the missiles fell rather than being propelled onto their targets. This robbed them of much effect. The system was fairly rudimentary and effective only against something as large as a city. They scored 2,419 hits in London and 2,448 in Antwerp, although about 19,000 V1s were launched at these two cities. They were vulnerable to fighters and presented anti-aircraft gunners with ideal training. In addition, they were often unpredictable at launching and sometimes failed to stabilize in flight, crashing soon after takeoff. Though they undoubtedly contributed to German morale and caused indiscriminate damage, they failed to have any real impact on the war. Allied science, in the development of proximity fuses, radar-controlled gunnery, had developed the V1's nemesis before they were deployed. The war was fought in many ways and at many levels. The war between the scientists was a hard-fought and in some ways close-run thing. American and British scientists and engineers occupied themselves with an enormous and continuous number of projects. Many were responses to enemy innovations and capabilities, while simultaneously there were many which were offensively driven. The degaussing of ships, jeeps, penicillin, amphibious trucks and tanks, the atom bomb, jet aircraft, code-breaking computers, napalm, new mines, bombs, rockets, torpedoes in a multitude of sizes and shapes, all appeared. Advances in pure research were few, but advances in practical research and applied technology were astonishing. Both the UK and US organized their scientific research as an important part of their war effort from the beginning. The support lavished on projects was not always given evenly, and some important projects were given apparently low priorities. However, the organization of the Allies' scientific effort far outstripped the German and Japanese. The V1s, slow, light, short-ranged and rudimentary, were an example of German science working relatively well. Their failings did not obscure their importance as a step along a new path. Once their launching ramps were pushed back from their targets, they became redundant. However, as an example of German science succeeding, they illustrate two factors that caused a lot of Germany's efforts to be wasted. Their development was too slow and their manufacture was indifferently managed. Also slow to develop were the rocket-powered V2s. These were far more threatening than the V1s. The first ballistic missile, developed by a team under Wernher von Braun with a 2,000-pound warhead, 4,000 V2s had been launched by the end of the war. The Second World War was the first major air war. Throughout the conflict, the military consideration that mattered most was control of the air. Local air superiority guaranteed German and Japanese success. As the war progressed, the Allied domination of the air increased, and with it, the certainty of Allied victory. That's the major lesson that the war confirmed for future combat. In all aspects of the conflict, in the air, on land, and at sea, technology came to be dominant. Tanks, submarines, and aircraft carriers were proven as critically important forces. However, aircraft proved to be able to dominate all. Much of this had been seen pre-war, and many felt that all the pre-war predictions had been proved. The victors would count their successes, but a sober assessment of the war became subordinated to the ideologically driven considerations of the Cold War, and some valuable lessons remained unlearned.